All right, the last thing I want to talk about regarding parabolas is in some ways the most important, and this is the reflective properties of parabolas and parabolic surfaces. So here we have part of the graph of a parabola. It's quite wide as far as parabolas go, but what I want to do is I want to look at what happens if we think of this as a reflective surface or a mirror. And what I want to do is I want to look at what happens when we have a bunch of parallel, whether this is light rays or whether this is something else. But I want to look at what happens when we've got these parallel light rays, let's say, and they reflect off the surface of this parabolic surface, off of this parabola. So if we look at the first one over here, and we look to see what direction this would reflect in, probably would reflect something like that. And then if we look at the next one here and we reflect that, it's going to end up reflecting kind of like this. And then if we look at the third one down here, the angle's going to be a little bit different there. And you probably can see what's going on, but we can look at these other two over here. If we look at how these light rays would reflect, we can see that they all end up generally going in the same direction. And even more so than that, they're all going to intersect at the same exact point if this is a truly parabolic curve, and that point is actually the focus, F. And so if we have a three-dimensional version of this, right now this is just a parabola in 2 dimensions, but if you were to take a parabola and kind of spin it around that central axis, and you get a parabolic dish, that is actually the shape of a satellite dish. And so a satellite dish works because it's pointed in the direction of the satellite that's sending the signals, and the satellite is going to send a whole bunch of signals all in parallel lines towards the satellite dish. And each one of those, wherever it hits the dish, is reflected to the focal point, which ends up being the part of the dish that receives the information. So these are generally pretty, not flat, obviously they're curved, but they're on the flatter side compared to some of the parabolas that we've drawn, and they're pretty wide to catch a wide array of signals from the satellite and send more and more of them all to that focal point. There are other ways that these shapes can be used in really interesting ways. One of them is for sound recording. Sometimes we want to hear sounds that are quite far away from a very particular point. And if we have a listening device that has this shape, what it'll do is it'll take all of the sounds that come from that exact direction and bounce them all in towards the receiver so that we can hear a little bit better in a very particular direction quite a distance away. In fact, there used to be, I don't know if it's still there, but on Market Street, I think between Montgomery and Powell, there used to be these two shapes that were similar to parabolas, but not quite. They were different. And you could be inside one of the dishes, and you could have a friend kind of a distance away inside the other, and you could speak fairly quietly, but you'd be able to hear each other from quite a long distance away because of these reflection properties. And there's one more thing I want to talk about as far as these go, and that is using the sun's rays along with one of these surfaces. And when I was in Uzbekistan traveling on my sabbatical, I went to a place called a solar furnace where they have a giant shape that's like this, a surface that reflects the sun rays to a focal point. And it's such a large surface that when it's a sunny day and they activate it in its entirety, the sun's rays can heat up the focal point to over 3,000 degrees Celsius, which is so hot it can melt all sorts of materials. It can test whether or not a material would withstand the heat to be coming into re-entry on the space shuttle. There's all sorts of cool things. And another thing they did, they had a much smaller version of this shape, and they actually used the sun's rays and this shape to set some leaves on fire. So this is really, really powerful. You can actually find YouTube videos if you search for parabolic mirror or parabolic dish and fire. You can actually see people using these to start fires, which is fascinating. And so I will link below to the part of my sabbatical project where I talk a little bit more in depth about this solar furnace in Uzbekistan, because it's really fascinating what can be done with a simple shape like this. So I hope you found this interesting, and I hope you spend some time going online and looking at parabolic dishes, videos on YouTube, to see the different uses for this particular shape.